Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with Dr. Jesse James. He's a research psychologist, and we're going to talk about the psychology behind conspiracy theories. What is their exact appeal? We'll talk more about this in our next conversation. You don't want to miss it. Check it out.
With that all said, with that groundwork laid, I think we can now jump into the psychology of conspiracy theories as it relates to these theories. So there's some things that I'll go ahead and say about just the psychology of conspiracy theories generally, like how they're operating and what's going on before we start the application. So conspiracy theories are, like I said, based on these natural processes that can either be amplified by personality types or by certain experiences that people have that kind of cause these mental bugs to go a little bit haywire, right? And that will result in distrust, uncertainty, and fear. And those emotions are kind of the undergirding emotions that tend to provoke people into rationalizing logically conspiracy theories, but they're really motivated by emotions before they're kind of pre-logical, right? So one example of these kinds of cognitive processes is pattern perception. Pattern perception is developing and understanding the world in cause and effect relationships. So usually this is a really adaptive and accurate process. Like this is what we talked about. Like it could be either the fast or slow process of your thinking, but you're trying to understand how do certain things in my life and environment relate to each other. This kind of process, this pattern perception, can be measured in the laboratory using really simple measures, like you'll put like an array of a bunch of random dots on a picture, and then you ask people, like, if you look at this image, do you see something? Do you see an image of something in the random dots? And you can,
like a ink blot test.
Yeah, much like that, right? It's what do you perceive in the nonsense, like in the randomness, right? And as people look at that, different types of people with different personalities are more likely to see meaning in the randomness than others, and certain people can be provoked into seeing more meaning in the randomness based on laboratory conditions. Like if you instill in them a feeling of fear or distrust or anxiety or things like that, you can cause them to be more likely to see meaningful pictures in the randomness. That's a laboratory evaluation of this phenomenon, but in real life, it's more like complex things, like trying to understand why somebody snubbed you in a recent interaction and trying to like connect that back to things that happened before, like comments they might have made in the past or people they might have seen you with, or trying to understand like what happened that I missed that could have caused their behavior in this situation, right? So it's that pattern perception is about trying to find cause and effect relationships in the world. And that is, if you think about it for a second, you'll see that that's the kind of process that people are engaging in when they're utilizing conspiracy theories to understand cause and effect relationships in the world, right? So people are using conspiracy theories to understand complex phenomenon that don't make sense on their surface, and we're coming up with stories, theories that kind of tie those events together in meaningful ways, right?
Okay.
So it takes, like I said earlier, a lot of education to kind of retrain yourself.
I mean, one of the things that pops into my head in the dating world is like, we're dating for a while, and then all of a sudden one person breaks up with the other, and then we're like, why did this happen? Isn't this the kind of thing that you're saying? I mean, is that a good example of this pattern recognition?
That's pattern perception. Yeah, exactly. When something like that happens and you try to come up with a story, an explanation.
Oh, I said that thing to her mom, and maybe that's why she doesn't like me anymore.
That's pattern perception. That's trying to tie together these relationships across events and things. It's not just that. Like we utilize pattern perception in basically every facet of our lives. You experiment with cooking different versions of a recipe, and you see that, well, the cookies didn't turn out this time. What did I do differently that might have made them not turn out that well? Am I at a higher elevation, or did I miss an ingredient, or did I swap something out? Or, so you're like, but you can say the same thing, like, going back to the example of, the bush rustling and, worrying that there might be a lion, or it might just be the wind, like trying to infer some causal thing to, caused the bush to rustle.
Oh,
that's
it was a
pattern
squirrel.
perception. Yeah, exactly. So like when we draw these kinds of theories, that's a very ordinary and intuitive process that is almost always adaptive and reasonable. It comes to fine conclusions. It gets us through life. It's a very useful skill to have.
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to be especially accurate in your causal attributions, sometimes you have to shut off your intuition and you have to really lean into data and scientific methods and other approaches of evaluating the true causes that might not be immediately obvious or that we might think are true causes, but once we end up collecting the data, we realize aren't true causes and things like that, right? So I'll give an example of how like these negative emotions of uncertainty or fear can end up resulting in these haywire cognitions. So uncertainty, for example, can cause people to feel increased sense making. These kinds of, this trying to tell the stories, making sense of the world, because they're trying to explain inexplicable or confusing events, phenomena, right? They're trying to, if you feel uncertain, you feel especially driven to ground yourself in something reasonable, right? So you try to increase the degree to which you're telling stories, such as like in the midst of a epidemic before natural science or natural medicine was really began to be practiced, people would come up with all sorts of explanations, demons or karma or things like that would that resulted in my getting sick.
Well, I love malaria because it literally means bad air.
Yes,
it must be bad air that's causing me to get malaria.
Yeah.
And it was mosquitoes. But we tried to figure out something. It stinks here. It must be the air.
Yes, we make some guesses. Yeah. So we draw these kind of intuitive relationship, and sometimes they were adaptive. Like if you avoided places that had those bad air, like then you often wouldn't get sick because the mosquitoes would hang out in the swampy areas where the air was stinky, right? So your sense making would be a very adaptive approach. Even if you got the answer wrong, it would still be a useful answer, right? Mm-hmm. So conspiracy theories are often the same way. They provide for us a particular utility in making meaning of the world that helps us feel grounded, even if they're not factually accurate. It just helps us in some ways to feel like I'm bonded with the people who agree with me on this conspiracy theory. I feel grounded in the sense that I feel like the fact that I can make some form of logical sense of this inexplicable series of events, something like that.
Well, and another example that I like to use in my statistics classes is polio. There's a Freakonomics episode. Maybe I'll post it on YouTube and show everybody. But one of the things that they found was polio always spiked in the summer, and people eat a lot of ice cream in the summer. Ice cream causes polio. Like there was really a movement to say, this must be it. We got to quit eating ice cream. Well, the other thing that people do in the summer is they go swimming. Yeah. And they swim in infected lakes and pools where lots of polio exists. Yeah. And that was the real cause. Yeah. But sometimes you can get these correlations. And in fact, the purpose of that video, which I still show in my classes, and we'll be showing again this spring, is that, correlation is not causation. But sometimes it can be kind of useful, like you said.
Yeah, it can be useful even if it's not completely accurate. Another example would be that when people feel uncertainty, they end up experiencing what's called compensatory conviction, where they end up kind of retreating back to strongly held beliefs that they can reinforce and restabilize their worldview when that worldview is threatened. They just dismiss the contrary evidence. They retreat back to their strongly held beliefs, and they become more entrenched to those beliefs, even if the evidence doesn't support them. So sometimes when you try to have a rational conversation with somebody about a conspiracy theory, they'll dismiss what you're saying and retreat back to the core of that theory and become more entrenched in it because that helps them negate the sense of uncertainty that they feel about the world when their worldview is threatened by contrary evidence.
So it's really a fear of uncertainty. Then is that what it comes down to?
Sometimes, yes, yeah. So that's one of the key emotions that kind of drives belief in conspiracy theories. And we know that. And so another one is fear. Fear can also result in higher levels of vigilance. Like if you're afraid, then you're more attentive to what's going on around you. You become more vigilant, and more vigilance ends up resulting in higher levels of agency detection, which is like with the example of the bush, we're trying to see like, is it just wind, or is there an agent like a lion that's causing that, that bush to rustle? Agency detection can be observed in anytime we ascribe to an event some purposeful human motive behind it, like, or it could be animal, but often it's a human motive. So like if we come home and there's poop on the front porch, we could ascribe to that nefarious. We could say, man, those neighbors are getting me back. They're pranking me back for this, this thing. Or it could just be like a dog came by and just, went there, right? Mm-hmm. But when you ascribe to in an unknown situation like that, in an uncertain situation, if you ascribe agency to that action, to that event, then you often will. Well, I should say you're often more likely to do that if you're if you have baseline levels of fear that are higher than other people, because you're more vigilant, you're just more anxious prone. People who are also slightly more paranoid. If you just have like a paranoid personality, you're more likely to observe these kinds of things as well. And those feelings of fear and uncertainty, they undergird conspiracy theories for the same reasons I was just describing. Because
can I give you an observation that I've noticed that seems like they should not be related, but in my experience, and this is anecdata, I guess, if anything, but it does seem like anti-vaxxers and Joseph polygamy are correlated.
Yes. Thank you for pointing this out. So we're eventually going to get to that point. But
well, you were just talking about the fear, and I think that's what it is. Fear of the vaccine. And I don't know what you could call the fear that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy or something. I don't know. That's a little bit fuzzy to me, but
we can talk about that for a second if you want.
Okay.
What are the?
Well, if you're going to get to it, I don't want to interrupt you.
Yeah, it's okay. What are the fears and uncertainties that might undergird somebody's belief in a conspiracy theory like that Brigham Young started polygamy? Well, one example would be if for example President Nelson comes out and says everybody should get the vaccine, and several of the 12 are shown getting the vaccine,
and they're pulling up their arm and showing the vaccine shot.
Exactly, demonstrating that they've received it. If your baseline belief is that vaccine is a negative thing, that there's a conspiracy going on to microchip us or to poison us or to mind control us or whatever it is.
I mean, I guess, there was, especially when the COVID vaccine came out, there was it did show that in some young men, especially enlarged hearts, and some had problems. And I don't want to downplay that, because I believe those are true. That's not a conspiracy theory. But the point is, when you look at the statistics, 99% of the population it's really good for. And if you're a young man, okay, maybe you should wait till you're 30 or something. Mm-hmm. I'm fine with that. But to me, it's irrational, and it's not understanding the law of large numbers. I'm sorry I'm getting into so many statistics here, but
the government came out and said that these are safe and effective, but they hadn't been tested over the long term before they were administered to the public. They couldn't be determined safe in that short term. They could be determined safe for the short term, but nobody could know a year, 5 years, 10 years from now what might be the side effects of that vaccine.
I'm going to grow a horn out of the middle of my head or something.
We laugh, but legitimately we don't know. Like, could we be at higher risk of heart disease, for example, 30 years down the road for having had this vaccine that we're unaware of right now? So So just to your point, there are legitimate reasons to be suspicious of the especially the messaging that this is determined safe and effective without really any appropriate caveats, without notifying certain groups that they maybe should be a little more cautious, and without saying like, well, we've determined this is safe over the short term, but we don't know what long-term consequences. There might be legitimate reasons why somebody would be concerned about the vaccine, but connecting this idea of the Quorum of the 12 showing that they were in support of the vaccines, that opposing your worldview that the vaccines are potentially nefarious, potentially dangerous, those are in conflict. And one way of resolving that conflict ends up being to find a way to kind of disempower the church authorities by, for example, breaking the chain of continuous authority from Joseph Smith to President Nelson. And you can do that pretty easily by saying, well, Joseph was a true prophet. He was good. He never started polygamy, but Brigham Young did. He was a fallen person. He was really lecherous and should never have been trusted. He was not really a prophet. And like every person since then has been to some degree suspect. And
so therefore I don't have to get my vaccine.
So I don't have to get my vaccine. It's that kind of...
I haven't heard anything like that, but...
But oftentimes these operations will function outside of our conscious awareness. Even if nobody who believes the Brigham Young conspiracy theory has ever pointed to that kind of explanation, that's the kind of explanation that could be validated scientifically, empirically, as operating outside of people's awareness. Like the fact that this theory it's been around since Joseph Smith died, but it kind of started to be picked up again in the LDS Church around the early 2000s, right? Mm-hmm. But it was existing for about 20 years before it really started to catch fire at, ironically, the same time as the COVID vaccine came out. And it's, as you pointed out, many of the same people who believe that the COVID disease and the COVID vaccine were both conspiracies who have picked up on this particular conspiracy theory. And I don't think it's for nothing that there seems to be a correlation in those groups. Mm-hmm. Because the motivations that are provoking people to believe in the Brigham Young theory they're often not like you might not be fully aware of the reasons why you want to believe this so much. You might not be aware of your own fears, uncertainties, and anxieties. But your belief in a conspiracy theory could still resolve those fears and anxieties, even if you were never aware of having had them.
We are going to have so much hate mail on this one. So all the anti-vaxxers and the polygamy skeptics are going to come after me and you.
Well, just don't share my phone number. So people can have certain experiences that will end up resulting in these kinds of feelings of fear, anxiety, uncertainty. I will call these trust-eroding experiences. These are all kinds of things in our environment today. These are, like they can erode our trust in authorities in particular, like science and government and institutions and mainstream media and in experts. And we've heard people being more and more suspicious of all of those entities, of all those different kinds of forms of authority. But the kinds of trust-eroding experiences that result in that distrust are things like so much of what we've seen in the last 25 years in particular: high inflation, political divisiveness, corruptions that have actually been uncovered in various institutions, widespread mental health challenges in the rising generation, political divisiveness. All kinds of problems have ended up resulting in people's feeling more uncertainty, more distrust, more fear and anxiety about society in general. And people then turn en masse to conspiracy theories to kind of assuage those concerns. And they don't realize the psychological motivations that are driving them to those theories because they don't feel emotional. They feel very logical. When you go through the points of a conspiracy theory, it seems like I'm trying to follow the facts. I'm trying to use logic and reason to explain this unexplained phenomenon. But really what it's doing is providing a sense of control and certainty in very tumultuous times.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah. The other thing is, like I hinted at before, within individuals who believe in conspiracy theories, there are certain personality types that are more prone to this kind of belief. So some of those personality types are people who are more pessimistic, who have a higher natural need to reduce uncertainty, people who have an external locus of control, meaning they believe that like they're less in control of things and they wait for the world to kind of operate on them, to kind of like, they just, things happen, and there's not much I can do about it. People who have those kinds of psychological mindsets are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories. Also, people who are more willing to believe in other kinds of things with limited evidence, like telekinesis and telepathy and things like that, are more likely to believe in conspiracy theories.
Essential oils.
I won't go there, but they're also more likely among extremists, and that could be either leaders, extremist leaders, or extremist adherents, like people who are just kind of following the latest political or religious or technological fear-mongering or whatever that is. And then these kinds of people are the least trusting of the rule of law at the outset because of their personality traits. But then by indulging in conspiracy theories, it further erodes their trust in institutions, in authorities, in science, in government, and they end up becoming more distrustful of law, and that kind of turns into a negative downward spiral where people become less and less trusting and more unstable in their views and feelings towards society. So that's just kind of general explanation of what's going on within the psychology of conspiracy theories. Now we can start to apply some of that material to some general conspiracy theories that are just out there in the world, and
Sure.
and also to the Brigham Young conspiracy.
We're going to hit
theory.
the Kennedy assassination, please.
That's what
I'd like to solve that
I
one.
wanted to steer clear of that one in particular. So one thing about conspiracy theories is they're particularly appealing and intriguing. They make people feel like they have elite insider knowledge, like they're on the inside. They figured out this code that other people are not aware of, and so it helps them to feel like they're maybe better than other people. And it also feeds sometimes a contrarian identity, where some people will feel like maybe they're rebelling against intellectual elites or against societal norms, and conspiracy theories kind of validate that already extant distrust and kind of helps them to kind of rebel against that. So some examples. So one example from just the field of conspiracy theories in general is Illuminati world domination. So this is the theory that world leaders, celebrities, powerful figures kind of all have a power monopoly, and they use symbols like the all-seeing eye and pyramids and certain hand gestures to kind of communicate their nefarious intent. And if
Masonry.
Yeah, exactly. And if you can decode these symbols, then you become part of the insider group. You have this secret knowledge that other people lack, and you're able to figure out the global mysteries. It feels like you're kind of unraveling this secret. Just the power that people have, that they're supposedly manipulating in this monopoly kind of way, the allure of that as a fascinating thing, and the attraction of feeling like you're on their side, you're like with them. You're not that you're, I don't mean to say on their side, but that you're like, that you know about it, that you're like part of it, that bestows upon you some degree of reflected glory, reflected power, right? So that's the reason why this particular conspiracy theory is very alluring, very fascinating, right? The Brigham Young conspiracy theory is actually also quite fascinating and alluring. It can give people a sense of superiority over those who accept the traditional narrative.
Those stupid elites. Those academics,
Yes.
they don't know anything.
Yeah, it can feel like that.
Do your own research.
Do your own research. It can feel like you are more informed, more enlightened, and some of the facts and information that are shared by the skeptics in podcasts and other places are actually quite fascinating. And there are things that haven't been shared in the traditional narrative before. And so when you hear this new information, every once in a while, you'll say, wow, that's like, why haven't I ever heard that before? And that kind of can reinforce your propensity to believe in that conspiracy theory for its allure and fascination.
But doesn't it feed both ways? Because other people will be like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And it just strengthens the person in their own resolve too.
Yeah,
like there's nothing you can do. You can't dismiss it. You can't say, wow, that's interesting. Everything just feeds the loop. It's all feedback loop.
It can. So you can see this on both sides. If people are relatively unobjective and aren't making a conscious effort to set aside their mind bugs, people who believe in the traditional narrative and people who believe in the alternate conspiracy theory can both end up engaging these same kinds of mental bugs, right? Okay, so another one is that conspiracy theories posit big causes for big incidents. This is known as the proportionality bias.
Okay.
So it's the idea that, like, if something in history had huge ramifications, there must have been really important, notorious things that led to that. And sometimes the actual facts of a situation don't seem particularly glorious or grand. They seem happenstantial or accidental. So if you invent a conspiracy theory, it can feel like the grandness of this theory is proportional to the grandness of the event that occurred. So one example from conspiracy theories generally is, of course, JFK, the Kennedy assassination. If JFK hadn't died, you can imagine there wouldn't have been any conspiracy theories, right, about his death, because there was no monumental event to be proportional to. It would have been like if one lone wolf had been identified, then people would have just been like, yeah, what a crackpot. But because one lone wolf was identified, and it felt inadequate to explain this really momentous event, people began to search for something deeper, something bigger to explain what happened.
Didn't that just happen last summer?
Yes, but see, in this case, Trump didn't die. But if Trump had died, you can imagine that the conspiracy theories would have become pretty widespread about that event.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. There was a scientifically executed study about that where the researchers made up a story about a leader in the country Benin in Africa.
Okay.
And they used this country because hardly anybody knows anything about Benin, right?
Well, there was a movie called Wag the Dog.
Okay.
And they made up a story about a coup in Romania, if I remember that. I think that's right. Okay. And just to rile people up, and there was nothing happened. Like, it was a total conspiracy theory, just so that the U.S. could go to war with Romania. It's really interesting. Yeah. Rated though, so you better not watch it. But
I'll have to look into it. So in this study, they made up a narrative about this. They made up a story about this leader in Benin who got in a car accident, and in some of the participants' reading, the leader died, and in some of them he didn't die. And then people were asked, like, about their beliefs about what might have happened in this situation, and the participants in this study were far more likely to believe that believe in a conspiracy theory. They were more likely to believe that a conspiracy was involved if the leader died than if he didn't die, right? Oh. Because in the one situation, it wasn't really a momentous event. It was just a car accident. In the other one, it was a potential assassination, right? It could have been an orchestrated car accident, right? Mm-hmm. And so if the leader dies, then people are more likely to believe in a conspiracy. Well, I'll just harken back to, it's not exactly the Brigham Young theory of polygamy, but as we already noted, there is this kind of ancillary tangential belief that Joseph, that when Joseph died, he was like there's, it was a very momentous thing in church history. It feels too small to just be because some crackpots didn't like the church, or he was just under religious persecution or something. And so we invent a wider spread or more nefarious kind of insider conspiracy theory to explain that small that in what in reality was a relatively small event in the history of the world. It feels very big to us, and so we kind of create this proportionally large conspiracy theory to explain that.
Very interesting.
It's similar.
I'm glad you explained this, because I never understood, because I've heard that the people who think that Brigham killed Joseph, that was somehow related to polygamy skeptics, and it never made any sense to me. But now that you've explained it, it's making more sense.
Yeah, it's not exactly tied in, but some people, some people tie it in. Yeah, some people do. But Samuel Smith, people have said the same thing, because he died just a few weeks, just like
Brigham
6 weeks or
poisoned
something.
him.
Yeah, so they say Brigham poisoned him, and I think that theory was maybe first posited by William Smith, if I'm remembering right. I think in a letter to somebody, he suggested that he thought Brigham
theory.
it was pretty early. But in reality, people got sick and died all the time in that era, right?
Because they didn't wash their hands.
Exactly.
And they drank cholera out of the river, which was full of the animal that just pooped in it.
Yeah. So if somebody gets sick and dies, the only reason why Samuel's death stood out as potentially deserving of a conspiracy theory was because of the timing of his death. If he had died 6 weeks before Joseph died, nobody would have thought a thing of it. But because he died 6 weeks after, and he had been appointed in one of Joseph's journals as the potential successor if he and Hiram both died, then people say, oh, that had to be intentional.
Brigham Young had to kill him so that he could take over.
And I'm not saying that that's impossible. It's certainly possible that somebody did poison Samuel, but the proportionality bias suggests that our bugs in thinking predispose us to assuming that there's a conspiracy theory more often in such a situation than in other similar situations, which makes us really need to step back and question our own assumptions and biases about that kind of
They didn't understand germ theory. I know that Joseph complained that he drank some coffee from Emma and she was trying to poison him too. I mean, they, maybe she didn't wash her hands. Maybe, maybe they got water out of the dirty river. I mean, there's a lot of things that could have explained it. I don't think she was purposely trying to poison him. I don't think Samuel was purposely poisoned either. Mount Meadows, there's Proctor Robinson. He was taking the hide off a cow, nicked his face or something, and died like 2 days later. Nobody knows why. The story at the time was, the Fancher party must have poisoned the cow, and so then the cow killed him, because we don't understand germ theory. And, that caused everybody to get mad at the Fancher party and whatever. Rick Turley actually, he didn't do it himself, but he helped commission a study where they exhumed the body of 14-year-old Proctor Robinson to see if maybe he died from anthrax, which was a very likely possibility. Problem was, you can't, the grave had gotten wet, and if there was anthrax, there was no trace of it anymore. So anyway, clearly it wasn't the Fancher party though. But I love how these things can just blossom, because, that was totally a conspiracy theory in 1857, 1858. We got to blame the Fancher party somehow. They must have, killed Proctor Robinson by poisoning the well. Or the spring.
That's a great example. Conspiracy theories also provide simple explanations for complex events. So this is kind of the opposite of the proportionality bias.
Okay.
It can happen.
So this is a different thing.
Yeah, this is a different operation. This is a different way in which our cognitive bugs are working. This ends up giving a sense of control and predictability to things. So, like in populist movements, like we see with really all over the world today, but Trump is one example. But there's lots of populist leaders being elected today.
Now we're making off all the Trump.
They'll often. Well, I hope everybody can acknowledge that Trump is a populist leader, even if they like him. that's just a fact. But populist political movements are more likely to be praised for telling it like it is when they give very simple explanations for things. Even though the reality might be very complicated.
Mexico's going to pay for the wall, right? Mexico paid for the wall, right? That kind of
thing. So if you give one-liners that oversimplify complex issues, that ends up feeling really comfortable. It ends up giving like a sense of certainty in really complex environments. Well, conspiracy theories can operate in that same manner. Very simple conspiracy theories, for example, can help to take a series of really complicated events and say, well, it was just one lecherous guy who just really wanted sex, and it's just as simple as that, right? When in reality, the polygamy. The reasons why Joseph might have instituted polygamy, if he did, were probably quite complex. They may have been somewhat motivated by sexual desire, but they may have also been motivated by sincere desires to do God's will and I don't know how many people will be on board with this, because as a psychologist, I tend to ascribe maybe a little more psychology to my worldview than other people do. But when I look at Joseph Smith, I see that he experienced several early traumatic experiences that led to symptoms of psychological dissociation throughout his later life, and often his revelations appeared to be kind of a dissociative state, and that may have made him both more susceptible to feeling the spirit, because maybe it was like, if theoretically our body is the mechanism by which God veils us, so that like if we're, if our spirits are stuck in this body and we're, say we're so, it's such a compelling simulation, this biology that we're in, that it kind of distracts us from the spiritual reality that is us. Then you could say anything we can do to kind of turn off that biology, fasting, sleep deprivation, certain drug use, psychological dissociation,
mushrooms,
could end up making you more sensitive to the spirit, but that doesn't necessarily automatically free you from the other side effects of whatever it is you're doing, right? So if you do mushrooms, maybe you really are actually more likely to get in touch with God, but maybe you're also more likely to have hallucinatory experiences, right?
Because are you aware that there's a theory going out that Joseph ate mushrooms and that's why he had all the visions?
Yeah.
Okay.
So some people are proposing that, for example, he spiked the wine in the
I've heard that one too.
Kirtland in the Kirtland dedication ceremony for for the sacrament, and thereby lots of people had psychogenic experiences. Yeah. But that, so my understanding of Joseph as somebody who was more sensitive to the spirit because of his psychological dissociations, but also that he had side effects from those psychological dissociations that made him potentially more likely to engage in polygamy, whether it was sanctioned by God or not. I think that that's a really complicated explanation for a complex person that Joseph is. And a lot of people would rather Joseph be a simple character, somebody who's, just a prophet. Everything he says is true and right and good. And Brigham Young is a very flat character of just a lecherous, evil person who, tried to, kill Joseph and, institute this practice of polygamy. And if you kind of flatten people into these black and white caricatures, that ends up being a really simple, easy way of grounding yourself in a particular worldview. So that's, again, a motivational reason why people would believe in a conspiracy theory like this.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Jesse James, a research psychologist. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about religious motivation and theological justifications behind the polygamy skeptic theories.
There are other theological reasons why people would want to believe in this conspiracy theory. So one is, again, in the wake of the first presidency pushing the COVID vaccines, this kind of a natural response to that fear and uncertainty, and members trying to find a way to kind of disempower the prophet by breaking that chain of authority. But another reason would be that most members continue to be bothered by historical polygamy or future polygamy, or both.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.